The morning mist clung to the ancient stone walls of Valdres Palace like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their hold on the shadows that had grown too familiar with darkness. Finn Ashworth pushed through the ornate iron gates that separated the royal gardens from the servants' quarters, his weathered hands gripping the handles of a wheelbarrow laden with fresh soil and seedlings. At 28, he had spent the better part of a decade tending to these grounds, watching seasons change the landscape while the palace itself seemed frozen in time and tradition. The scent of jasmine and morning dew filled his lungs as he navigated the winding cobblestone paths, past the elaborate fountain where crystal-clear water danced in choreographed streams. This was his sanctuary, his domain where noble politics couldn't touch him. Here, among the roses and lavender, he was more than just another servant. He was an artist painting with petals and leaves. A peculiar sound caught his attention as he rounded the corner near the Queen's Memorial Garden. It was barely audible above the gentle splash of water features, but unmistakable once heard the weak, desperate whimpering of something small and helpless. Finn's heart clenched as he recognized the sound. Growing up on his grandmother's farm, before palace life claimed him, he'd heard it before, the cry of creatures abandoned and dying. Following the sound, he discovered a sight that made his blood run cold. Behind an overgrown hedge of thorn bushes, in what had once been the late Queen's private meditation alcove, lay 3 wolf cubs. They were pitifully thin, their once lustrous coats now dull and matted, their bright eyes clouded with hunger and despair. The smallest of the 3 could barely lift its head, while the other pressed close together for warmth that their bodies could no longer provide. "Sweet Mother of Mercy," Finn whispered, dropping to his knees beside them. His trained eye immediately assessed their condition: severe malnutrition, dehydration, and the telltale signs of abandonment. These weren't wild cubs, their collars, though tarnished, bore the royal seal of Valdres. These were the Queen's beloved companions, the trio of Arctic wolves she'd raised from pups before her untimely death 6 months ago. The largest cub, a female with silver-touched fur, managed to lift her head at his approach. Her eyes, though weak, held an intelligence that spoke of royal breeding and careful nurturing. She didn't growl or show fear. Instead, she seemed to recognize something in Finn's gentle demeanor, perhaps sensing the same compassion that had drawn her late mistress to rescue her mother from northern trappers years ago. "What have they done to you?" Finn murmured, extending his hand slowly. The cub's situation suddenly made terrible sense. Queen Isabella had been devoted to these creatures, but her death had left them in limbo. The king, consumed by grief and affairs of state, had likely forgotten about them entirely. The palace staff, without direct orders, had probably assumed someone else was caring for them. The smallest cub, barely breathing, was clearly the most critical. Finn gently scooped him up, feeling the prominent ribs beneath the thin coat. The little one's heartbeat was rapid and irregular, classic signs of starvation. Without immediate intervention, none of them would survive another day. Working with practiced efficiency, Finn carried the cubs one by one to a secluded potting shed at the far end of the gardens. The space was warm and dry, filled with the earthy scents of soil and growing things. He fashioned a makeshift bed from old burlap sacks and dried moss, creating a nest that would hold their body heat while protecting them from the morning chill. From his personal food stores, the simple fare allotted to palace staff, Finn began preparing what he hoped would be a suitable meal. He diluted some sheep's milk with warm water, adding a touch of honey for energy. His grandmother had taught him that starving animals needed gentle refeeding. Too much too quickly could shock their systems beyond recovery. The female cub, whom he found himself calling Frost for her silver markings, was the first to accept the improvised formula. She lapped weakly at the milk he offered from his cupped palm, her tail attempting the faintest wag. The second cub, darker with distinctive white paws, followed her lead, but the smallest one, the one who most desperately needed nourishment, remained listless. "Come on, little one," Finn whispered, using a clean cloth to dab milk on the cub's lips. "Your mother wouldn't want you to give up now." He thought of Queen Isabella, remembering how she would walk these very gardens with her wolves at her side, her laughter echoing off the stone walls. She had been the soul of the palace. the gentle heart that balanced the king's stern pragmatism. Hours passed as Finn worked tirelessly, alternating between feeding attempts and gentle massage to stimulate circulation. His official duties forgotten, he remained focused entirely on the fight for 3 small lives. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the shed's single window. And still he persisted. Finally, as the morning gave way to afternoon, the smallest cub, whom Finn had begun calling Shadow for his dark coat, managed to swallow a few drops of the milk mixture. It wasn't much, but it was enough to kindle hope in Finn's chest. All 3 cubs were now responding, their breathing steadier, their eyes beginning to show sparks of the vitality that had once made them the pride of the royal household. But even as relief washed over him, Finn realized the magnitude of what he'd undertaken. Caring for these cubs would require constant attention, proper food, and medical care, all things that would be noticed, questioned, and potentially punished. Servants who overstepped their bounds, no matter how noble their intentions, faced dismissal or worse. As Shadow finally managed to keep down a substantial amount of milk, Finn made his decision. Whatever the consequences, he couldn't abandon these creatures as others had. Queen Isabella had saved them once. Now it was his turn to honor her memory by ensuring they survived. The afternoon bells chimed across the palace grounds, their bronze voices carrying news of the hour to all who dwelt within these walls. Finn knew he should return to his official duties, but looking at the 3 small lives now sleeping peacefully in their makeshift nest, he understood that his real work was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new risks, and the constant threat of discovery. But tonight, for the first time in months, the Queen's beloved wolves would sleep with full bellies and warm hearts, watched over by a gardener who had chosen compassion over caution. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around the palace like a velvet shroud, broken only by the occasional flicker of torchlight from the guard towers. Luna Blackwood moved through the servant corridors with the practiced silence of someone who had learned to navigate the palace's hidden arteries without disturbing the slumber of nobles. At 25, she had spent 7 years in service to the royal household. Rising from scullery maid to her current position in the main kitchen's a modest achievement that she wore with quiet pride. Her arms ached from the weight of the copper pot she carried, filled with the rich bone broth that had been simmering since yesterday evening. Cook Henley had been puzzled by her request to prepare such a quantity of the restorative soup, but Luna had spun a tale about an ailing aunt in the nearby village. The lie sat uncomfortably in her chest, but the alternative, revealing the truth about Finn's desperate mission, would have been far worse. She had discovered his secret 3 days ago, quite by accident, delivering leftover scraps to the compost bins near the garden sheds. She had heard voices coming from the old potting shed. Curiosity had gotten the better of her, and peering through a gap in the wooden slats, she had witnessed something that stopped her heart. Finn Ashworth, the quiet gardener she had admired from afar for months, tenderly feeding 3 wolf cubs that should have been dead or relocated weeks ago. The sight had haunted her dreams and occupied her every waking thought. She knew about the Queen's wolves. Of course, everyone in the palace did. They had been as much a part of the royal household as the crown jewels, beloved by their mistress and tolerated by the king out of affection for his late wife. But after Queen Isabella's death, the wolves had simply vanished from palace life. Most assumed they had been sent to a sanctuary or given to another noble family. The reality was far more heartbreaking. Luna paused at the garden gate, listening for any signs of movement from the guard posts. The changing of the watch wouldn't occur for another hour, giving her precious time to reach Finn undetected. She had spent the past 3 days wrestling with her conscience, torn between the safety of anonymity and the pull of her heart toward both the suffering animals and the man who risked everything to save them. The morning mist provided additional cover as she made her way along the familiar paths. Her soft-soled shoes made no sound on the wet stones, and her dark cloak blended seamlessly with the shadows cast by towering hedgerows. She had walked these gardens many times during her off hours, always hoping for a glimpse of the handsome gardener who tended them with such obvious devotion. Finn Ashworth was unlike the other male servants in the palace, where they were often crude or ambitious. He possessed a gentleness that drew her like a moth to flame, She had watched him coax life from seemingly dead plants, seen him rescue injured birds and nurse them back to health in hidden corners of the greenhouse. His hands, though calloused from labor, moved with an artist's precision whether he was pruning roses or sketching botanical illustrations. In his worn leather journal, the potting shed came into view, and Luna's heart hammered against her ribs. Warm light flickered through the single window, indicating that Finn was already there. Beginning his daily ritual of care, she approached slowly, not wanting to startle him, and knocked gently on the wooden door. "Finn," she called softly, "it's Luna, from the kitchens. I know about the cubs." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. She could hear movement inside, the soft whimpers of the cubs, the rustle of straw, Finn's sharp intake of breath. When the door finally opened, she was met with a face that showed equal parts fear and resignation. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His hair was disheveled, his usually neat appearance showing the strain of sleepless nights and constant worry, despite his exhaustion, or perhaps because of it. He looked more handsome than ever, vulnerable in a way that made her heart ache. 3 days, Luna admitted, stepping inside when he gestured for her to enter. The sight that greeted her was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. The cubs, though clearly improved from their near-death state, were still pitifully thin. They had been arranged in a nest of soft materials, with clean water and food bowls nearby. The smallest one, still weaker than his siblings, lay curled against the others for warmth. "I brought broth," she said, lifting the pot. "Bone broth, with marrow and herbs. Cook Henley swears by it for restoring strength." Finn's eyes widened, with surprise and something that might have been hope. "You're not here to report me?" "Report you for what?" "For having the courage to do what everyone else was too afraid or too selfish to do." Luna set the pot down and knelt beside the cubs. The female, whom she would later learn Finn called Frost, approached cautiously, her nose twitching at the rich scent of the broth. "This is madness," Finn said, running his hands through his hair. "If we're caught, we won't be," Luna interrupted, surprising herself with her confidence. "Not if we're careful. I know the kitchen schedules, the guard rotations, the servants' routines. I can help you." "Why?" The question was simple, but she heard the complexity behind it, the wonder, the gratitude, the fear of hoping for something too good to be true. Luna looked at the cubs, then at Finn, and felt her heart make a decision that her mind was still catching up to. Because they don't deserve to die forgotten, because Queen Isabella loved them, and love shouldn't end with death, and because, she paused, gathering courage, because I've watched you in these gardens for 2 years, and I've never seen anyone care for living things the way you do. What you're doing here, it's not just about the cubs. It's about being the kind of person who chooses compassion over safety. The silence that followed was charged with unspoken emotions. Finn's gaze held hers, and for a moment, the world outside the shed ceased to exist. There was only the soft breathing of the cubs, the warmth of shared purpose, and the electric awareness of two souls recognizing something profound in each other. "I don't even know your full name," Finn said finally, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth despite the gravity of their situation. "Luna Blackwood," she replied, extending her hand. "Assistant to the head cook, amateur healer, and apparently conspirator in wolf rescue operations." He took her hand, and the contact sent warmth shooting up her arm. "Finn Ashworth, Royal Gardener, amateur veterinarian, and grateful beyond words for your help." They spent the next hour working together in comfortable synchronization. Luna heated the broth over a small brazier while Finn prepared the cubs for feeding. She watched him work with growing admiration, the way he spoke to each cub individually, assessing their condition with practiced eyes, adjusting his approach based on their unique needs. Shadows gaining weight, she observed, noting how the smallest cub managed to lap up the broth with increasing enthusiasm. "He's a fighter," Finn agreed, gently stroking the dark fur, like his mother was, according to the Queen's journals. "You've read her journals, only the ones about the wolves. I found them in her private study after the funeral. No one else seemed interested in them." His voice carried a note of sadness that resonated with Luna's own grief for the beloved Queen. As the morning progressed, they developed a routine. Luna would bring food and supplies while Finn maintained the cubs' care and monitored their health. They spoke in whispers, sharing stories of their lives within the palace walls, their dreams beyond them, and their growing concern for the 3 small lives they had committed to saving. "The king doesn't know, does he?" Luna asked as they watched. "The cubs sleep peacefully after their meal. I don't think he remembers they exist." Finn replied sadly. "He's been different since the queen died, more distant, more focused on state matters. It's like he's trying to bury his grief under duty." "Maybe that's how he survives it," Luna suggested gently. "Some people need to feel useful to feel alive." Finn looked at her with newfound respect. "You're very wise, Luna Blackwood." "I'm very observant," she corrected. 7 years of kitchen work teaches you a lot about human nature." As the sun climbed higher, they knew their time was running short. Luna would need to return to her duties soon, and Finn had an entire garden to maintain his official responsibilities. That couldn't be neglected without raising suspicion. "Tomorrow?" Finn asked as they prepared to part ways. "Tomorrow," Luna confirmed, "and every day after, until they're strong enough to figure out what comes next." Neither of them spoke about the ultimate challenge they faced. What would happen to the cubs? Once they were healthy, they couldn't remain hidden forever, and the palace was no place for growing wolves. But for now, it was enough to focus on the immediate goal of keeping them alive. That as Luna made her way back through the morning mist, her heart felt lighter than it had in months. She had found purpose beyond her daily duties, and more importantly, she had found a connection with someone who shared her deepest values. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential reward, not just for the cubs, but for the possibility of love blooming in the most unexpected of places. Prince Dorian Valdris stood at the tall windows of his private study, watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across the palace gardens below. At 32, he possessed the strong jawline and piercing blue eyes of his royal lineage, but the past 6 months had carved lines of grief around those eyes that aged him beyond his years. His dark hair, usually impeccably groomed for court appearances, hung loose around his shoulders, a small rebellion against the suffocating protocols that governed every aspect of his existence. The untouched breakfast tray on his desk had grown cold hours ago, much like his appetite for the duties that awaited him. Today marked exactly 6 months since his mother's death, and the palace felt emptier than ever. The vibrant energy that Queen Isabella had brought to these halls seemed to have died with her, leaving behind only the rigid formality that his father wielded like armor against his own pain. A flash of movement in the gardens caught his attention, to figures moving with obvious stealth toward the old potting shed. Dorian's interest sharpened as he recognized the gardener, Finn Ashworth, and one of the kitchen staff, a young woman whose name he didn't know but whose face he had noticed in passing. Their furtive behavior was unusual enough to warrant investigation, especially given the increased security concerns that had followed several recent assassination attempts on neighboring kingdoms. Pulling on his riding boots and a plain brown cloak that would help him blend with the garden shadows, Dorian made his way through the palace's hidden passages routes his mother had shown him as a child. During their games of hide-and-seek, the memory brought a familiar stab of pain, but also a strange comfort. Isabella had always encouraged his curiosity, even when it led him into situations that horrified his tutors. The morning air was crisp against his face as he emerged from a concealed door in the garden wall, moving with the stealth that years of hunting expeditions had taught him. He approached the potting shed from the rear, where a gap in the wooden planks would allow him to observe, without being detected. What he saw through that gap stopped his breath entirely. 3 wolf cubs lay in a nest of soft materials, their silver and dark coats catching the morning light streaming through the window. Even from a distance, Dorian recognized them immediately: Storm, Frost, and Shadow, his mother's beloved companions, the cubs she had raised from infancy, who had followed her through these very gardens like loyal shadows, who had slept at the foot of her bed and shared her meals from golden dishes. The cubs he had assumed were dead. His hands clenched into fists as he watched Finn and the kitchen maid Luna. He remembered now working together with obvious care and affection. They spoke in whispers as they prepared some kind of broth, their movements synchronized like partners in a dance. The smallest cub, Shadow, was clearly the weakest, but even he showed signs of recovery that would have been impossible just days ago. Rage built in Dorian's chest like a gathering storm. These cubs should have been found weeks ago, should have been brought to the royal physicians, should have been given every possible care as befitted the queen's cherished companions. Instead, they had been abandoned, left to die while the palace continued its daily routines as if nothing had changed. But beneath the anger lay something else, a recognition that these two servants had done what no one else, including himself, had thought to do. They had looked beyond their own safety and comfort to care for creatures that mattered to no one but a dead queen. The sound of approaching footsteps made him step back into the shadows, but he continued watching as Luna departed and Finn settled in for what was obviously a long session of care. The gardener's gentleness with the cubs, the way he spoke to each one individually, the obvious exhaustion that came from sleepless nights spent nursing them back to health, all of it painted a picture that made Dorian's anger turn inward. He waited until Luna was well away before stepping around to the front of the shed. His knock on the door was firm but not aggressive. He wanted answers, not to terrify the man who had been doing what Dorian himself should have done. Finn Ashworth, he called quietly. I know you're in there, and I know what you're hiding. We need to talk. The silence that followed was deafening. Dorian could almost hear the man's heart hammering, could imagine the fear that must be coursing through him when the door finally opened. Finn's face was pale but determined, his shoulders squared as if he were prepared to face whatever consequences awaited him. Your Highness, Finn said, offering a bow that was respectful but not servile. I can explain. You can explain how my mother's cubs came to be abandoned in a garden shed, while the palace pretended they didn't exist. Dorian's voice was low but carried the edge of royal authority. You can explain how you've been caring for them in secret while I've been. He paused, the words catching in his throat. While I've been too lost in my own grief to remember they existed. The accusation in his own words hit him like a physical blow. He had forgotten. In the chaos of funeral arrangements, political maneuvering, and his own drowning sorrow, he had simply forgotten about the 3 small lives that had meant everything to his mother. Your Highness, Finn said carefully, they were dying. I found them 3 days ago, nearly dead from starvation and neglect. You couldn't just let them die. Dorian finished, stepping into the shed. The sight of the cubs, up close, was even more devastating. They were so much smaller than he remembered. Their once glossy coats dull from malnutrition, but their eyes held the same intelligence, the same spark that had made his mother laugh with delight when they performed tricks or solved puzzles. Shadow, the smallest, looked up at him with recognition that made Dorian's knees weak. This cub had once played with him as a child, had stolen food from his plate during family dinners, had slept curled against his feet during long winter evenings, when the whole family would gather by the fire. Storm, Dorian whispered, kneeling beside the silver-marked female. She approached cautiously, her tail giving the faintest wag as she caught his scent. Sweet Storm, I'm so sorry. I'm so very sorry. The dam of emotion he had been holding back for months finally burst. 6 months of carefully controlled grief, of public appearances and diplomatic meetings, of being the strong prince who could carry on his mother's legacy. All of it crumbled as he gathered the weak cub in his arms and wept. Finn stood frozen, clearly uncertain whether to retreat or offer comfort to a grieving prince. But as Dorian's sobs echoed in the small shed, something in the gardener's demeanor shifted. He knelt beside the prince, his presence offering silent support without presumption. She loved them so much, Dorian choked out. She said they chose her, not the other way around. Their mother was caught in a trap near the northern borders, and Isabella insisted on rescuing the cubs personally. She hand-fed them, slept with them in the nursery, taught them to hunt in the palace gardens. I know, Finn said softly. I read her journals. She wrote about them every day. You read her journals? Dorian looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but sharp with interest. Only the ones about the wolves. I found them in her private study after the funeral. No one else seemed interested in them, and I thought. Finn hesitated. then continued with quiet courage. I thought someone should remember how much she loved them. The simple statement hit Dorian harder than any royal decree. The servant, this gardener whose name he barely knew, had shown more devotion to his mother's memory than he had himself. The realization was humbling and painful, but also strangely liberating. "What do you need?" Dorian asked, his voice steady now despite the tears still wet on his cheeks. "To keep them alive, to make them healthy, what do you need?" Finn's eyes widened with surprise. "Your Highness, I don't understand. You saved them when I failed them," Dorian said firmly. "You risked your position, your safety, probably your life to do what I should have done. Now I'm asking, what do you need to finish what you started?" The transformation in Finn's expression was remarkable. Hope replaced fear. Determination replaced uncertainty. Proper nutrition, medical attention, a safe place to grow. They can't stay hidden forever, but they need time to recover fully. Done. Dorian said without hesitation. "I'll arrange for the royal physician to examine them discreetly. Food, medicine, whatever they need. And I'll find a solution for their permanent care." "Your Highness, the risk is mine to take," Dorian interrupted. "These cubs are my responsibility, my mother's legacy. I won't fail them again." As they worked together to tend to the cubs, Dorian found himself studying Finn with new interests. The man's knowledge of animal care was impressive, his devotion absolute. But more than that, he possessed something Dorian had rarely encountered in the palace: genuine integrity. Here was someone who acted not from ambition or duty, but from simple compassion. "The kitchen maid," Dorian said as they prepared fresh bedding for the cubs. "Luna. She's helping you." "She is," Finn confirmed, his voice carrying a warmth that made Dorian smile despite everything. "She's been remarkable. You care for her." It wasn't a question, and Finn's blush confirmed what Dorian had suspected. "I barely know her, Your Highness, but yes, I find myself hoping to know her better." "Then you shall," Dorian decided. "Both of you have shown more courage and compassion than most nobles I know. When this is over, when the cubs are safe, I'll see that you're both rewarded appropriately." "We don't need rewards," Finn said quickly. "We just need to know they'll be safe." "They will be," Dorian promised, his hand resting gently on Storm's head. "I give you my word as a prince and as Isabella's son. They will be safe, and they will be loved." As the morning stretched toward afternoon, the two men worked side by side, united in their purpose despite the vast differences in their stations. Dorian found himself remembering why he had once loved spending time in the gardens with his mother. There was something healing about nurturing life, about being part of something larger than political machinations and court intrigue. When they finally paused for rest, the cubs sleeping peacefully in their nest, Dorian made a decision that would change everything. "Finn," he said quietly, "I want you to know that what you've done here, it's not just about saving 3 cubs. You've reminded me of something I'd forgotten, something my mother tried to teach me about what it means to truly rule. Your Highness, a king's greatest duty isn't to his crown or his country," Dorian explained, his voice carrying new conviction. "It's to protect those who cannot protect themselves. You've shown me that a gardener can be more royal than a prince, if he has the courage to act on his convictions." The weight of those words settled between them like a sacred oath. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new risks, and the monumental task of finding a permanent solution for the cubs. But tonight, for the first time in months, Prince Dorian would sleep knowing that he had chosen compassion over protocol, love over duty. And in a small shed in the royal gardens, 3 cubs slept safely, watched over by a prince who had finally remembered what it meant to be his mother's son. Duchess Celeste Ravencrest glided through the marble corridors of Valdres Palace with the practiced grace of someone born to navigate treacherous political waters. At 41, she possessed the sharp intelligence and calculating beauty that had made her one of the most influential women in the kingdom. Her auburn hair was swept into an elaborate style that spoke of both fashion and authority, while her emerald silk gown whispered against the polished floors with each measured step. As the king's chief advisor and the late queen's closest friend, Celeste held a unique position within the palace hierarchy. She had been Isabella's confidant through years of marriage, motherhood, and the delicate dance of royal diplomacy. Now, 6 months after losing her dearest friend, she found herself serving as both counselor to a grieving king and protector of a fragile kingdom that sensed weakness in its ruler's sorrow. The summons to investigate unusual activity in the palace grounds had come from Captain Brennan. Of the palace guard, a man whose loyalty was absolute, but whose imagination was limited. Reports of servants moving about at odd hours, unauthorized use of kitchen supplies, and Prince Dorian's increasingly erratic behavior had reached his ears. Through the complex network of informants that kept the palace secure, Celeste had dismissed most of it as the natural result of a household still adjusting to the Queen's absence. But one detail had caught her attention: multiple sightings of the prince in the gardens, often in the company of common servants. Given the recent assassination attempts on neighboring royalty, any deviation from normal patterns warranted investigation. Her destination was the administrative wing, where all palace records were meticulously maintained. If there was something amiss, the evidence would be hidden in the mundane details that most nobles ignored: food inventories, staff schedules, maintenance requests. Celeste had learned long ago that the truth was rarely found in grand proclamations, but in the small inconsistencies that careful observation could reveal. Lady Margaret Ashford, the palace's chief administrator, looked up from her ledgers with the harried expression of someone perpetually behind on her duties. At 63, she had served the royal family for decades, and her loyalty was beyond question. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her ink-stained fingers spoke of countless hours spent maintaining the records that kept the palace functioning. Duchess Ravencrest, Margaret said, rising with a respectful curtsy. "How may I assist you?" "I need to review the household records from the past month," Celeste said, settling into the chair across from Margaret's desk. "Specifically, any unusual requests or changes in routine. The king has asked me to ensure our security measures remain optimal." Margaret's expression grew troubled. As she pulled several thick ledgers from their shelves, "There have been some irregularities," she admitted, "nothing that seemed significant at the time, but in aggregate, they paint an interesting picture for the next hour." Celeste immersed herself in the minute details of palace life: food requisitions that didn't match standard meal preparations, requests for medical supplies without corresponding physician reports, and maintenance schedules that had been quietly altered without proper authorization. But it was the pattern of staff movements that truly caught her attention. "Luna Blackwood from the kitchens," she mused, running her finger down a list of early morning departures from the servants' quarters. "She's been leaving her quarters well before dawn for the past week." "Yes, and Finn Ashworth has been working extended hours in the gardens," Margaret added, "far beyond what his duties require. Master Garrett has mentioned it several times." Celeste felt the familiar tingle of a mystery unfolding. Her years at court had taught her to recognize the signs of hidden activity, whether it involved political conspiracies or romantic liaisons. But this felt different, more purposeful, more desperate. The prince's movements during this same period, she requested. Margaret consulted another ledger, her brow furrowing. "Prince Dorian has been spending considerable time in the gardens as well. His personal guard has reported difficulty maintaining proper security protocols due to his unconventional routes through the palace." A picture was beginning to emerge, and Celeste felt her pulse quicken. 3 people, all moving with obvious secrecy, all converging on the same general area of the palace grounds. Given the prince's recent emotional state and the servants' clear dedication to some hidden purpose, there were limited explanations that made sense. "I need to see the Queen's personal effects inventory," Celeste said suddenly. "Specifically, any items related to her pets." Margaret's face went pale. "Your Grace, those records were sealed after the funeral. The king's explicit orders were that no one was to disturb the Queen's private chambers." Celeste corrected gently but firmly. "He said nothing about reviewing administrative records." "Now, please." With obvious reluctance, Margaret retrieved a smaller ledger bound in blue leather. The inventory of Queen Isabella's personal possessions was heartbreakingly detailed: every gown, every piece of jewelry, every book and letter carefully catalogued. But it was the final section that made Celeste's breath catch. 3 Arctic wolves, ages 8 months at time of inventory, she read aloud. Storm, Frost, and Shadow. Status, pending relocation to. She looked up sharply. The entry is incomplete. There was some confusion after the funeral, Margaret admitted. The Queen's personal secretary had already departed for her family estate, and no one seemed certain what arrangements had been made. So they were simply forgotten, not forgotten, exactly. There were assumptions that someone else was handling the matter. The king was overwhelmed with state business. Prince Dorian was. Margaret paused delicately. The prince was not. Receptive to discussions about his mother's belongings, Celeste closed the ledger with a snap, her mind racing through the implications. If the wolves were still alive, still somewhere on the palace grounds, then the secretive behavior of the servants and the prince suddenly made perfect sense. But it also represented a catastrophic failure of palace administration and a potential scandal that could damage the royal family's reputation. I need the Queen's private journals, she said, rising from her chair. All of them, Your Grace. I'm not certain I have the authority. You have my authority, Celeste said with quiet steel in her voice. And unless you wish to explain to the king how his wife's beloved companions were abandoned and forgotten, you'll provide me with everything I need to understand what's been happening in this palace. 30 minutes later, Celeste sat in her private study with a stack of Isabella's journals spread before her. Reading her dear friend's words was almost unbearably painful, but she forced herself to focus on the entries about the wolves. Page after page revealed the depth of Isabella's love for the creatures, how she had rescued them, raised them, trained them to be both companions and symbols of the wild beauty she had always championed. But it was the final entries, written just weeks before Isabella's death, that made Celeste's heart clench with understanding. The cubs are growing so quickly now. Storm has learned to open the garden gates by herself, and Shadow's attempts to hunt the palace cats provide endless entertainment. Dorian pretends to be annoyed when they steal food from his plate, but I've seen him sneak them treats when he thinks no one is watching. They will be such comfort to him when I'm gone. I pray they remember how much they are loved when I'm gone, Celeste whispered, tears blurring her vision. Isabella had known she was dying, had been planning for her family's future even as her own time ran short. The wolves weren't just pets, they were intended to be living links to her memory, sources of comfort for her grieving husband and son, and they had been abandoned, forgotten in the chaos of grief and politics. Celeste made her decision with the swift certainty that had served her well in 20 years of court life. Rising from her desk, she selected a plain cloak from her wardrobe and made her way toward the gardens. If her suspicions were correct, she would find the prince and the 2 servants working together to save creatures that should never have needed saving. The morning sun was climbing toward its zenith as she approached the potting shed, guided by the same careful observation that had led her through the administrative maze. The sound of voices from within confirmed her deductions, and she paused at the door to compose herself before knocking. Prince Dorian, she called softly, it's Celeste. I believe we need to discuss your mother's wolves. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft whimpering of animals and the sharp intake of breath from multiple sources. When the door opened, she was greeted by the sight of Prince Dorian, his usually immaculate appearance, disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed, but blazing with defensive determination. Duchess Ravencrest, he said formally, but she could hear the underlying challenge in his voice. I wasn't expecting you. No, I imagine you weren't. She stepped into the shed, taking in the scene with the careful attention that had made her Isabella's most trusted advisor. 3 wolf cubs, clearly recovering from serious malnutrition, but alive and alert. A young man she recognized as the gardener, his hands stained with medicine and his face showing the exhaustion of sleepless nights.